Well, hello there. So in this video, we're going to do some practice with the equilibrium actually that we just talked about. And actually, these prompts are very similar to the prompts that we've already looked at. So hopefully, right, you've got them all memorized, and then we can just go through them. There's a ton of them here because they're great to get some good practice with these. At the same time, normally during class, right, we would kind of split them up and say, you take the first six, you take the next six, and things like that. I'm going to go through all of these with you though. Your mileage may vary, but I think that it's useful to think about what happens to output and what happens to price levels as a result of these aggregate demand, aggregate supply shifts. Now, significant boom in the stock market. That's the idea of wealth, right? And that's going to affect consumption spending. So that's aggregate demand going up. If aggregate demand goes up, think about the lecture that I just did. GDP will go up and price levels will go up. Okay, now so that's kind of the pattern here. Businesses expect higher inflation soon. So this means that eventually the costs will go up. And so we'd say the aggregate supply will decrease. And that decreases GDP, but it increases the price levels. So just so you can kind of remember what that looks like, remember we've got on this previous page, page 6, if aggregate supply goes down, price levels go up, output goes down. So that's kind of what we're doing here. Americans express preference for new international automobiles. That's in net exports. And actually, it's going to increase our imports. So it will bring aggregate demand down. That decreases GDP and decreases the price levels. Congress expands higher education to improve human capital. So this one is kind of a twofer here. We could say, well, when they expand higher education, we could say that that's government spending going up, or you could actually say productivity, right, goes up. So either one of those, but depending on how you answer this, right, we could go with two different answers. If it's just the government spending we're talking about, then that would be aggregate demand going up. But if it's the productivity going up, then we'd say aggregate supply goes up. Now, in both cases of that, we'd say that the output goes up, right? If aggregate demand rises or if aggregate supply does. But the price level effect would be different. If aggregate demand goes up, then the price level will rise. If aggregate supply goes up, the price level will fall. So this is why we would say things, businesses will often say, yeah, this is a great idea because kind of the price levels won't be affected, but we'll get more output out of this. And that's kind of nice. But again, on a test, it's going to be super clear. Pick one of these two things. You're not going to see both. Businesses report larger inventories at the end of the year. That's investment spending. So that's aggregate demand going up. We know that increases both price level and GDP. Increased income of a global trade partner. That means like the Europeans are buying more of the Americans' stuff. And so that means our net exports are going to rise. And so aggregate demand goes up, output and price levels go up. Businesses invest in new machinery, right? So again, here we've got a twofer, investment going up, but their productivity is rising. So we could say aggregate demand rises, and we could say aggregate supply. Either one of those would be acceptable answers for this problem. In either case, though, more output, but we may end up having kind of two different answers for the price level. Again, on a test, it'll give you really specifically, we're looking at the productivity side, kids, so talk about aggregate supply and the price level going down, right? Or, hey, in business are investing, so that's the aggregate demand side. Congress cuts personal income taxes. This one's going to affect consumption spending and it's going to increase it. Many students usually miss these, remember, and they say, well, that's going to affect government spending. No, it doesn't. If the government cuts taxes, they aren't going to necessarily cut back with their spending. You and I might think very differently from how the US government thinks about its budget in that sense. So aggregate demand goes up, output and prices go up. Congress votes to expand immigration. Remember, this is supply of labor. And so this is the wages of the workers. And remember, wages are a resource. And so aggregate supply would increase, causing output to rise and price levels to fall. Okay. Central bank increases the money supply, which changes the real interest rate. Now, this is a tricky one, but remember way back to the aggregate demand, I said interest rates, real interest rates, will affect aggregate demand because it affects the consumption and it affects the investment spending. And if real interest rates are now lower, and it's not because of prices changing in the economy or something, it's actually the actual interest rate has changed. If they're lower, people are going to borrow more and finance more spending, which increases aggregate demand. So output and prices both go up. Consumers expected strong job market soon. And this one, This is going to increase consumption, so aggregate demand goes up, up, up. Saudi Arabia cuts oil production, so this is going to be a resource, right? Remember, a resource, and it's going to make the resources more expensive. So aggregate supply will decrease. Output goes down, but prices go up. Remember, that's the worst of all of those. Job training programs increase in popularity. So this one, if this is productivity, right? Productivity, then the aggregate supply would go up, output goes up, and prices go down. And so kind of thinking about what are the connections that we can make between the shifters and these prompts. Government cuts pension payments, not government spending. Remember, pensions and Social Security, those don't count as spending because it's not goods and services. But this does affect consumption, and it would reduce consumption. So aggregate demand goes down, down, down. This next one, businesses reduce their purchases of new equipment, new manufacturing equipment. So all we know here is that investment spending changed. And we know that investment spending went down. We can't necessarily say that it affected productivity, right? Even though in number 7, it says it did. In this one, it doesn't tell us anything about that. It just says, hey, they cut back on it. So all we really know happened was that the aggregate demand decreased. Businesses create worker training programs. So again, this one is the productivity one, right, from just a couple before. And in this one, your workers are more productive, so the aggregate supply would rise, more output, and lower prices. Lower inflation. So this one right off the bat should tell us it's the price level changing. It means lenders decrease nominal interest rates. Well, if it's inflation, price levels don't shift the curve. So this is a curveball for you. But if it's the inflation changing, then price levels aren't going to shift. And so we won't see that. And again, if you're thinking to yourself, what the heck, why? Well, what are price levels? Well, price levels are right along the y-axis. And so if we just move along the y-axis, we're just moving to a new point on here. We're not necessarily changing aggregate demand or aggregate supply. Okay? So no change, and we cross those out. Electricity prices increase due to a carbon tax. So this is kind of the resources, right? Thinking about resource costs. And if they're more expensive, we'd say aggregate supply decreases, output goes down, and prices go up. Congress cuts defense spending. This is a good example of government spending. And so this is aggregate demand decreasing, right? Because they're cutting their spending. So output goes down, price levels go down. Investment spending, well, that one just tells you right off the bat. I goes down, AD goes down, down, down. US dollar increases in price compared to the euro. So if it increases in price, US goods increase in price. If the things that are dollar denominated, or the dollar's more expensive, then the things that you buy with the dollars are more expensive. So therefore, our net exports would decrease because we can't sell as many goods to other countries. And so we'd say aggregate demand goes down, decrease, decrease. Labor productivity rises. So productivity, well, that's the P in IRAP, remember? So productivity right there. And if productivity is going up, then aggregate supply is going up, increasing output, decreasing the price levels. The last couple here, higher domestic price levels reduce domestic exports. Well, price levels, here we go, don't shift the curve, right? Got a bit right here, hang on a second. So price levels don't shift the curve. So we're not going to shift anything here in that sense. Fracking drives down energy costs. This one's resources. And again, these are just really ones we've seen already. And so it's going to increase aggregate supply because it's cheaper to produce goods and services. And so it increases output and lowers prices. Consumers fear a recession is coming. Well, if they fear that, they're going to cut back on their spending. So output would go down and prices would go down. Rising price levels decrease consumers up. Price levels don't shift the curve, right? Price levels don't shift the curve. So no change. Union membership decreases. Now this one is a twofer as well, I would argue. So for us, right, we're going to start with wages. And so one direction you could go would be consumption would go down. Another direction you could go would be resource prices. And so we could say, well, aggregate demand goes down, or you could say aggregate supply goes up. And actually, I would prefer the aggregate supply one. If you see a test question that talks about wages, always prefer to shift aggregate supply, right? Just always shift aggregate supply unless it's really clearly telegraphing to you, hey, talk about consumption spending. And it'll key you in if that's the case. But 99% of the time, especially on AP tests, this curveball is the wages, they're an input, right? Because the cost of production. The vast majority of firms, the biggest thing they spend their money on is their wages to their workers. So you've got to think about that as aggregate supply most of the time. So we'd say, so that's what I'm going to answer it as. Aggregate supply increase, output goes up, price levels go down. Home buyers express preferences for newly constructed houses. That's investment spending. Aggregate demand going up, up, up. Increase in Social Security payments. Another one where students sometimes get mixed up and they think it's the government. This is consumption spending, and it's going to rise. So up, up, up. And then the last one, government cuts environmental regulations. So actions by the government affecting producers is the A in IRAP. And so this one, actions, right? And so it's a aggregate supply would increase, output would rise, price levels would fall. Okay, so I'm going to say here you've got kind of a whole bunch of practice scenarios with this one. And ideally, you've been able to kind of test your practice and knowledge with these. Hopefully it helped. See you next time.